Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas book, babies. And it's a... What is that? Over the prairie doth I see with my fair eye. Other than a ghoulish face so pale and white, it doth make me tremble. Hello, book boys. How you doing, Phil?
I don't know what the fuck just happened. I hope it sounds better on the actual recording, because it sounded like the mic is up your ass when you spoke. I'm doing great. It's almost Christmas. It's December 20th today, and it's very late in Germany and very early in Japan, where Nick is. So I am drinking and already have been for a while. And Nick is being a little girl, only drinking coffee in the morning. No beers for Nick today. Unbelievable. It's only 7 a.m.
I'm not drinking coffee. I'm drinking a paracetamol lemon drink. Because I'm currently as of the last 2 days, in my new Tokyo apartment, having moved. And this building was actually built probably exactly in the midway point between the present day and the day that this book that we're talking about was published. And if you know anything about book boys, we like them old. So my the point that I'm trying to make is it's very cold.
Oh God.
And I'm trying not to get a cold. But I would actually really like a beer right now. I would definitely drink one if I had one.
I'm drinking Mönchshof Bockbier.
Bless you.
Shout out that's for free if you want to sponsor us. All right, guys, let's talk about the book.
Be very happy if we just got a beer sponsor. Anyway,
I know you would.
What are we reading today, Phil?
We are reading The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So we have this tradition on the podcast that every year for Christmas we read a Christmas-themed book. And then we realized that, actually there aren't that many of those. And instead of... so we did the Tolkien Letters to Father Christmas, we did the Christmas Carol. And instead of reading something actually Christmas-themed, like, I don't know, fucking Miracle on 34th Street or something... we decided to read The Turn of the Screw because I heard from Nick that it was Christmas related, which, let's just clear it up right now. At the beginning of the book, the narrator goes like, on Christmas Eve, people gathered for a little spooky story night, and then the book goes into a story that takes place in June, so... It's literally not related to Christmas at all. We never go back to the intro, and so yeah, but this is our Christmas episode, and if you don't like it, well, you can just go home.
Yeah, stuff it, nerds. Yeah, this, what was I going to say? When we decided on this tradition, when we didn't really decide on it, it just kind of naturally developed this sort of idea we'd do a Christmas episode. We didn't anticipate how few Christmas books there are actually that exist.
Well, there are some still, though. We still have some big ones to go through. But I don't know why we went for this one.
There are a couple. We've been on a bit of a horror bent recently, and I think we've just been kind of picking from a selection of different, like, classic horror stories. And, yeah, we were keen. I mean, neither of us went into this with any idea of the actual content of the book. But I was really looking forward to like a Christmas themed, like Christmas period, like horror story.
Yeah.
I've never come across anything like that before. And I think the reason I've never come across anything like that before is because it probably doesn't really exist. But, well.
It was funny because I made the thumbnail for this video, like thinking, it's going to be all Christmassy, and I made it like a snowy mansion, and then I read the book and it's like, they all gathered around the fire, and then they started talking about the story. Once upon a time in June, and I'm like, for fuck's sake.
was a really great image as well. Maybe we'll release it on the Patreon.
Together with Nick's used underwear subscription.
I'm sitting on a
And
hot
you don't
carpet,
wanna
so I'm
know-
getting it. I'm sitting on a hot carpet, so I'm getting it extra fruity.
Yeah, you don't even want to know what he uses the underwear for. It's not what you think. So
Thanks for that. Yeah. So, Turn of the Screw.
I'm lying. It's all made up. Yeah, Turn of the Screw.
Written by Henry James. If there's anything, I think is becoming a bit clearer reading, through a lot of the books that we've done through Book Boys, is if something says that it's serialized, you can probably anticipate like how it's gonna turn out. I think so. This book was serialized in 1898 over the course of a couple of months, and then later kind of collected. And for that reason, there's like a couple different versions. There seems to be at least two different versions, or with slightly different language. But yeah, you can. I think there's something to be said about reading this book as a serialized, like, month by month thing or week by week thing versus like reading it all at once, and then kind of also, I guess, understanding that this maybe was kind of maybe pulp is definitely not giving it justice, because I do think I did quite enjoy like parts of it, but definitely felt like it was doing that kind of shock and awe and kind of like of reading, the kind of experience of reading itself and kind of the drama of reading, rather than necessarily like going for any particularly like super deep themes. I do think there are some good themes to talk about for sure, but I think that when you see serialized, you can kind of anticipate a bit more of that style of writing, maybe.
Yeah, it's not like it's not like there's no positives, but I'm not gonna lie, I fucking hated it. It's probably my least favorite book I've read in a long time.
Wow, really?
To be very Christmassy and generous.
So let's go through a very quick summary first, and then I want you to tell me the things that you had trouble with. So as Phil explained, the book starts actually from a different place with a different narrator called Douglas, or a different character called Douglas, who their friends gathered around a fireplace talking about stories, and this guy brings up the story of this a manuscript written by his sister's governess. And a governess is someone who's in charge with these two children who are the niece and nephew of this, I think his name is Luke, who's this the uncle of these two children. It's implied that these two children's parents are dead, and he's entrusting them to this woman for their education and their care and stuff like that. So we follow, from her perspective, their manuscripts basically written by the protagonist as she's caring for these children in this manor, this place called Bly Manor. And eventually she has run-ins with these quite scary, ghoulish people who she later kind of finds or begins to believe are old housekeeper, and I think an old
just
servant,
some guy,
maybe.
Literally some guy.
Well, he's a housekeeper, I think, or like he was a member of the household,
maybe. Yeah.
But we become less and less convinced throughout the book that what she's saying is actually a real reflection of what's happening, and whether she's just kind of hallucinating, even though she's fully convinced. And it kind of changes her perception of the children as well. She sort of thinks that the children are haunted, or they're getting possessed, or that these spirits want to get them. And it kind of all climaxes with her finally discovering and still denying that these children can't see these spirits. And in one kind of dramatic scene at the end, in order to kind of prevent the young boy from seeing this ghost and potentially being like possessed by it, she goes to grab him and finds him dead in her arms at the end. So it kind of like, yeah, it goes through this beginning with kind of like a strange things are happening. There's this horror element, and we believe that we're seeing ghosts, but then as the story progresses, we become less confident in this protagonist narrator, and sort of see what she's seeing as a bit of like a psychotic, like hallucination episode that ends up kind of destroying everything around her.
Let's talk about the three interpretations a little bit. So there's the main one reading, which maybe was chronologically also when the book came out, would be like the first way people read it is, this is just like a horror story, and these ghosts are really real, and she's seeing these ghosts, they exist, and then in the end the boy gets killed by the ghost. The second reading would be to say that she is hallucinating everything, and that at the end that is to say there are no ghosts, and at the end when she grabs the boy, that she like accidentally suffocates him, because like it's written how she like tightly holds him for a while, so that he doesn't turn around to see the ghost or whatever. And then the third interpretation is that actually the very point of the story is to show that whether something is real or not, whether whether you can really trust your senses in interacting with objective reality, whatever that is so ambiguous that we're kind of not supposed to know whether it's real or not, whether the governess is crazy, or if there is some supernatural element, or both. So yeah, kind of an exercise in displaying this kind of feeling of uncertainty. And I think we've all had moments like those in our life where something big happens. I think for a lot of people it's like the loss of a loved one or something, or maybe, I don't know, divorce, or they find their wife cheating, or they find out their child isn't there. So some scary shit basically. Where you kind of feel detached from reality, and you walk through the town and you feel like you've I don't know, you figure out the Matrix kind of, like until yesterday I was walking through town and saying hello to everyone and going to class, but now I realize that actually if I don't show up to class, nothing happens, and I could literally strangle someone right now and maybe get away with it. Like that kind of feeling of super reality.
Yes, that feeling that we've all had.
Strangling people. No, the kind of social norms and rules, and the logical and probably true consequences of your actions. You can detach yourself from those if you go into this esoteric, like, oh, we're all just particles in the universe, and this is the Zizek thing about Buddhism, right? If I stab someone, I don't really kill them. It's just particles drifting into another particle. This kind of feel of surrealism in a way almost is, if I had to pick a positive thing about the book, I would say that it does actually describe that pretty well, especially toward the end.
Yeah. as you can kind of probably imagine, for a book of this setting, which seems to be some kind of like probably like East Coast American, like it gives sort of like upstate New York kind of vibe or something, I don't know, or English countryside maybe, where you can imagine social norms being very rigid, talking about there's a lot of talk about like class as well, like the young boy Miles is like him, I mean, it's like explicit reference, like explicitly talking about like the second sex, and like his like him growing into this like I'm a man, I'm talking to the protagonist, calling her dear and stuff like that. And so you do get a big sense reading this book of like, yeah, it's in this context of like very specific like social norms, and with them going to church, for example, and her one day deciding that she needs to go back to the house and skips out on the service, and all the consequences that come with that.
And then the other governess, the like her like friend, almost her conversation partner, she can't read or write pretty much, or not. Yeah, she can't read, so there's a lot of dynamic with that, with the class thing there.
For sure. And I think on that note as well, there's a lot of like the class dynamic plays out in that as well, because the reason that governess, her name is Mrs. Groves, she's kind of like the head housekeeper, I guess. The reason that a lot of this kind of psychosis gets entertained is because of that social division between the protagonist and between her. The protagonist is like, you know, this educated, essentially like a babysitter in charge of these children, making sure their education goes well, and making sure that they're, I guess, like fulfilled beyond their like basic needs that the servants provide. But she also has, because of that, she has this authority. So when she has these episodes where she sees spirits and she confides in Mrs. Groves, part of the reason that Mrs. Groves seems to entertain her visions is because she's seen as like the superior authority, and what she says is more valid or of more consequence than what Mrs. Groves herself could say. Yes, I agree very much that kind of that social class thing is quite interesting in terms of like this horror, like as a element of the horror.
Yeah, and so let's talk about for a second, because this goes into what you just said, to make a case for those different interpretations, right? So the first one is the ghosts are real, the second one is ghosts are not real, she's crazy, and the third one is we're not supposed to know. And so one trouble I've had with the second interpretation, that the governess is just imagining all this, is that the children do kind of say scary shit sometimes, and they do act irrationally. Like one time, like they go outside during the night to meet with the ghosts, apparently, or like they say like Miles clearly is like a little fucking devil or something. I don't know, like the way he speaks sometimes, like unless the narrator is so unreliable that we can't even trust the words, the literal like quotes from the boy himself. You know, if we take, I don't know, if we take what he says at face value, he does seem to be kind of a creepy child, and something is not quite right with him, I feel. So I don't think it's the it's all in her head, there are no ghosts interpretation is kind of, it gets stuck at that point for me, because there's clearly weird shit happening, and the other governess, Miss Gross, also strongly feels that way about the child. So like, even though she doesn't maybe see the ghosts, and it's not clear that she can't see them, or if she just is in denial, or if she maybe came there too late and couldn't see them or whatever, but she does have an issue with the children in that manner. And so that's one thing that speaks for the first interpretation again, that there is something supernatural going
on. The kids definitely do give off a bit of a creepy vibe, and there's a lot of speculation on the part of the protagonist as to like what the motives of the children are, and it flips. Interestingly, like I'm not so convinced of them, like, having finished the book, I wasn't super convinced of those as necessarily like an indication of the kids being evil. But I do think, you definitely fed a lot of evidence to believe to draw that conclusion, and I think it would be fair to say so, probably. But the kids are also, you kind of get this like these two, the protagonist is kind of split between these two understandings of the children. The first is that they're the sweetest, most pure, most beautiful things in the world, and the second that they're horrid, like manipulative little wretches that are actually just doing it in order to, as like a game, and in order to kind of get what they want. And it is a bit hard to kind of to determine which is true. But I think children, even the nicest children do actually kind of do that, whether they're being possessed by spirits or not. They will kind of like find kind of subtle, sweet ways of manipulating situations in their favor, and whether that's because they are manipulated by ghosts or whether they're haunted or whatever is another thing, maybe.
Yeah, you're right. I guess I would say that if it's real children, though, it usually is in a kind of like a silly, childish way, whereas Miles in particular, like just the way he speaks and conducts himself, you get the feeling that he is much older than he actually is mentally, and that he's really above things and manipulating everything in a way almost. And again, we could say that maybe that's in her head, and that would make sense in that way as well. But if we go with the idea that he is truly wicked, he does kind of speak like a master manipulator, not like a 6-year-old or whatever is supposed to be.
For sure. And I think as well, maybe something that would... So at some point, I kind of briefly mentioned it earlier, but talking about like the class dynamic, the protagonist begins talking about Miles, his like status as male, and like what the implications are for that. And she kind of like discusses how he's sort of growing into his like status or superiority, I guess, in a way, and begins addressing her as dear and stuff like that, and begins kind of talking to her in a way that, and you see it in the in his speech itself, like the way that he talks to the protagonist feels very much like, if you were reading it from any other character, or if you're reading it out of context, you would just assume that it's like someone who's older or at least the same age, who carries like a higher social status. And yeah, it's very difficult to. I mean, this probably lends most to the third interpretation, that it's difficult to kind of really tease out with confidence whether that is him being, a kind of stereotypical child who is born into an incredibly wealthy situation surrounded by adults who are of lower social class to him, and just being comfortable knowing that he has that authority, or whether it's a sign of something else. I think if you were to look at it from, I think, kind of historically, I mean, I can't really comment on this. Obviously, I'm definitely not an expert on this. And
back in 1880, when Nick was still 60.
Very funny. We're like 4 years apart or some shit, you fucking prick. But it doesn't feel like completely unusual, the idea that like you would have children kind of behaving like that. Anyway, so we were going to talk earlier about the things that you hated about the book, and I want to go back to that before we lose that. So
yeah.
You begin and I'll jump in.
Okay, I'll try to say this in a way that won't get us cancelled. And I say this half in jest, but also with a grain of truth. There's not enough testosterone in this book. Let me explain. So there's pretty much is, until the very end where the boy dies, literally no content. Nothing happens. There's nothing scary, pretty much. And 90% of the words on the page are two incredibly hysterical women just going back and forth, freaking out about the most normal fucking shit you've ever heard about. It's like and we've talked about this in the last thing we read for Halloween, the House on Haunted Hill, where I think the meme we kind of made for ourselves is the house evilly. That is to say, like, there's nothing really scary being described, but it's just the words themselves are like, hey reader, yeah, you there on behind the page, you feel scared right now, don't you? Huh? Because I said the word scary. See how that works? There was a lot of that in this book, and like to a point that it almost felt like intentional, like trying to make almost fun of these women in a way. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, the child, they'll be hyperventilating pretty much, and like discussing with each other for like 10 pages about like how fucking scary this is and this thing that happened and how horrible it is, and they use all these colorful words like, oh, how horrid, I could never imagine such a thing, oh, poor Miles, how could he? And then it's literally like, he went outside for like an hour, and you're like, oh, okay. That's what happened, really? Oh, come on. And then it'll just do that again for the next 50 pages, and again and again and again, and it's like, okay, I get it, nothing is happening.
So I mean, my take on that, I think, was that it was pretty much intentional to kind of to present this like hysterical episode and how this like hysteria transfers between people.
Well, I think you're right, but it still is horrible to read. I feel like, because it's like you're in a room with like two people, you just want to slap and be like, come on.
Yeah, no, I get that for sure. It's definitely a frustrating read at points, quite a lot of points. This tacks onto that as well, but generally I found the language of the book to be really, 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 really obnoxious. Like, a lot of the writing is incredibly obnoxious. And as you kind of said, like, there's a lot of, like, there's so much spoken about things that could be really revised into, like, one sentence. Yet, for some reason, you have these, like, 2-3 page, really almost indecipherable, like, passages that it was like it required so much concentration to read, but it ended up actually not really, like, giving me anything. Like, when we've read, like, Zarathustra, for example, you know, if you spend the time, you know, really poring over the pages and rereading and confirming your understanding of what's happening, you really come out with something. But with this, it was very much just like, you're like trying to just understand, like, okay, so she put the plate down and then she went outside and then she looked over the prairie and then she came back inside. Okay, that's what happened, right?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up Zarathustra. I think it's like the perfect comparison because without being like a little Nietzsche fanboy, too cringy, but Zarathustra is like, you read one sentence, like every sentence is like a little semen of knowledge in your brain taking roots. But with this one, it almost felt like the author is like intentionally trying to piss you off, seeing like how long they can string you along saying pretty much nothing, and also having these like obnoxious let's just say characters, let's not describe the sex, like, you know, like a fucking throw back and forth, like nothing saying dialogue to each other, where you're like at some point I literally laughed out loud reading, not because it was funny, not because it was scary, but because I was like, oh, for fuck's sake, this motherfucker is still trying to fucking test me, huh? Like,
absolutely. And there really is no way around it either. Like, it's, yeah, that was by far the most frustrating part of the whole thing. I do think, though, what I would say is that I did find, for all of that, like, especially with the encounters with the ghosts, I did really enjoy the way that those parts were written. And I would disagree with you about the house haunted, the haunted house haunted hauntily kind of thing. I didn't get that as much from this book, and there were moments where I was reading where I was genuinely, I mean, it wasn't like particularly gripping, like, or gripping in a scary way, but there were moments in the book that I thought the writing did actually line up quite nicely. But it's kind of like a monkey with 1,000 typewriters thing, that, like, in between the moments of where you get some really interesting, quite creative writing, you get everything else is just so overwritten. And I think overwritten is probably the word. You know, it's nice when you have, like, very creative and, like, ways of describing things when it's like a point of drama. But if we're just talking about, like, the most menial, inconsequential, everyday thing, it makes it, like, super difficult to follow and frustrating, and requires so much more concentration than there needs to be, I think. You also just kind of feel like it's almost like, it's like, why is it made so impenetrable, like, or why is it made, it kind of had me thinking about The Fountainhead, honestly, when I was reading it, kind of imagining this serialized newspaper and a bunch of, you know, upper society toffs, like, talking about it and pretending that they completely understood everything, when most of them probably didn't spend nearly as much time reading it to fully understand. I don't know, it just kind of made me think of that when I was going through it.
To add on to, I see what you say with what you're saying with the so let's recap a bit. When you said you don't agree about the point of the house evilly, this is the most inaccessible podcast. What you mean to say is that in The Haunting of Hill House, we had the problem that the author tries to inflect a scary feeling on the reader without describing anything scary, but simply by the usage of the words. Whereas in this book, there actually is some underlying, creepy atmosphere, which I would agree with. And it's not simply that they try to force scary words onto the reader, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I do agree to some extent. I mean, there is this book is much more atmospheric. It tries to create the horror element through atmosphere rather than concrete happenings, which The Haunting of Hill House did have happenings, like the blood on the wall, or some kind of actual like banging on the door. On the flip side of that, this book had so little things occurring that it kind of got me annoyed as well. Like, for example, the two ghosts that appear in the book, they literally don't do anything. They're like the nicest people I've ever met in my entire fucking life. Like, if I had a child and I don't know, I have to give my young baby boy to some person on this planet for like a week, I probably give it to these ghosts because they're so fucking nice. Like, they literally don't do anything. Like, they appear and they just stand there, and like there's nothing. They don't walk, they don't talk, they don't act, they don't throw over a vase. And we could have done this while keeping the element of, ooh, is it really happening, or is she crazy? Like, there could have been a vase breaking, and then it could have been like, oh, did the ghost throw over the vase, or did she bump into it or something? But there's literally nothing. These ghosts do nothing. And even in the ending scene, and I get that this fuels into the whole ambiguity thing, but the way the boy dies is like, she looks down at the boy and then she's like, oh, he's dead. The end. Like, there's no even if she imagined the whole thing, there is no rationalization of her going like, oh, the ghost must have frightened him to death, or like, because the ghost is in that scene, the ghost is behind the window and she is inside holding the boy. Yeah. Like, there's no description of the ghost doing anything that could have caused this, even in her own craziness, if we take that interpretation.
Well, what I would say, and this is another thing, I think that's actually quite a positive thing, a strong point, because like, her whole preoccupation is like, and I think this is actually a theme of the book, is like purity and preventing like the corruption of children. And so she's like really preoccupied with not raising a fuss, and which is why she keeps this between her and Mrs. Groves, and none of the other housekeepers know about this. And it's why she goes to great lengths to try and keep these children from these ghosts that she believes are preying on the children. And so I thought, honestly, I mean, she literally jumps on him to stop him from turning and looking out the window and seeing the guy standing there as she sees him. And I think part of this, the commentary on this book, and I wouldn't say it's like super strong, but I do think it is kind of one of the main themes, is this kind of like maternal obsession and maternal care. And I in this case, it's like, my kind of closing interpretation was like how this kind of obsession with maternal care conversely causes harm, or conversely like leads to these kind of like distorted psychosis sort of things. And seeing, it's not, it seems to her that the most important thing is for the children not to see these ghosts, and in order to keep them pure and to keep them young and to keep them not evil. And I think that is what motivates her behavior. And we also see that when this, I think this is also supported when, closer to the end of the book, Flora, the young girl, is missing, and the protagonist and Mrs. Groves go out to find her, and they find her at this kind of like isolated part of the Bly Manor grounds. And when they find her by herself, but the protagonist is convinced that the female ghost has taken her out there, and but she's not there, she's alone. But when they turn around, the protagonist sees the female ghost on the other side of the lake staring at them. And Mrs. Groves, we find out, doesn't see anything, but when she turns to the child and asks the child, like, don't you see this? The child's basically like, what are you talking about? And then suddenly the child is like, Flora is like, I don't, she don't want to see her anymore. She basically completely turns on the protagonist and hates her. And the protagonist describes her in that moment as looking like an old woman and being like bitter and like having all these like qualities. And maybe in that sense, there's like you could maybe interpret that as Flora, having seen the female ghost, has then been possessed by it. But you could also say that it's the psychosis of the main character seeing Flora and putting on this like, I failed her and now she looks like this old woman, and now she's lost her innocence, when it actually, maybe in reality, it's the fact that this protagonist is like revealing her insanity to this child, that's turning the child, spoiling the child's purity, if you could say.
Very good point, but I'm gonna give the counter argument to that, the ghosts are real argument to that side, which is that the male ghost is called Peter Quint, and this like old housekeeper or whatever who died, and at the ending scene, so as you said with Flora and also Miles as well, both the little girl and the boy, there's always this back and forth where she's like trying to admit them that the ghosts are real, but she wants to, that really when they go outside they're seeing the ghosts, right? So they show me then, like, that's what you're doing, right? But she also wants to keep their purity, so she tries to not bring it up, but kind of hint at it suggestively. If we can trust the narrator and like the objective like narrate, or I guess it's written from her perspective, is it? I don't know.
It's written from the protagonist's perspective. It's her manuscripts,
Okay, I thought so. Right, but so if we can trust the actual reporting of what the boy says verbatim, if that's not influenced by her insanity, then at the end, she does get the boy to admit about the ghost. So there is just before he dies, they have this dialogue about what really happened at the school. So okay, little tangent. For the whole fucking book, we know that Miles got expelled from school, but we never find out why. And she's always kind of like, oh, this must be because there's something wicked about the boy that he's hiding or something. But let's not try to make him say it because we want to keep his purity. And so at the end, she's kind of getting him to admit a lot of stuff like, oh, you really did take my letter that one time, didn't you? And shit like that. And then when she asks like, oh, who, I forgot what the exact question was. It's like, who were you meeting with, or who are you seeing, or like, who is this, like, what are you afraid of? The boy screams, like almost like he's dying. He screams, Peter Quint, which is the name of the like, you like in a, and he says like a word like you like you wench or something. He says like, oh, of course I'm seeing Peter Quint, you wench. Don't you fucking get it? Like, there is a moment like that. And so yeah, if we can believe the narrator, then that would be toward the ghosts are real. If we can't believe, then well,
okay. I'm really glad that you brought this up, because, and I don't know whether this is because of my illiteracy or because of how annoying this book is written, but I'm not sure if it was him that said Peter Quint, or whether it was her that said Peter Quint. And I'm gonna read a quote here. I'm gonna try and find a good place to jump in, where I'm not 100% sure it's actually him saying it. So this is the very end of the book, where the protagonist sees is with Miles, and she's confronting him about the reason that he was kicked out of school. And as she's speaking to Miles, from behind Miles, she sees the face of Peter Quint in the window, walking towards the house. And she kind of shows on her face that she's spooked. And Miles says, "Is she here?" Miles panted as he caught with his sealed eyes the direction of my words. Then, as strange as she staggered me, and with a gasp I echoed it. "Miss Jessel, Miss Jessel." He with sudden fury gave me back. I seized, stupefied, his supposition, some sequel to what we had done to Flora, but this made me only want to show him that it was better still than that. It's not Miss Jessel, but it's at the window straight before us. It's there, the coward horror, there for the last time. At this, after a second in which his head made the movement of a baffled dog's on a scent, and then gave a frantic little shake for air and light, he was at me in a white rage, bewildered, glaring vainly over the light, and missing wholly, though it now, to my sense, filled the room like the taste of poison, the wide, overwhelming presence. It's he? I was so determined to have all my proof that I flashed into ice to challenge him. Whom do you mean by he? Peter Quint, you devil! His face gave again around the room, its convulsed supplication. Where? So here, I think it's actually her saying Peter Quint and not him. Because at the beginning it says, "Is she here?" He says, "Is she here?" And the reason that it says, "Is she here?" is Miss Jessel here is because Miss Jessel, this is after the drama where the protagonist reveals that she's seeing Miss Jessel to the children, to Flora, and clearly the information gets passed on to Miles. And then he's surprised when she says that it's he. Maybe I'm getting mixed up here. But
I don't know. I mean, I get what you're saying.
So if we just look at like the if we just think about the order of speech, he says it's he as in it's Peter Quint, right? And then it goes, I was so determined to have all my proof that I flashed into ice to challenge him. Whom do you mean by he? So she's questioning him. Who do you mean by he? And then she continues by saying, "Peter Quint, you devil." Then it says, "His face gave again around the room its convulsed supplication. Where?" So he's asking where. I don't know. I read this a couple times.
I guess that's intentional, as well, right? Like,
I would hope, maybe it is. I'd hope it is intentional, because it is really vague.
But yeah, in my reading, it was him saying it, which made the whole thing a lot more fun. But
yeah, I wasn't 100% sure.
I guess I'm not either, but yeah,
it could be both.
I feel like it's more fun if he says it. But there's also the to go on a small tangent. There's also the whole thing of like suggesting, like leading the witness, right? Especially with children. So in the 80s, and there's a book about this. It's quite interesting. But in the 80s, there was this big scandal in the U.S. where a lot of people believed there were like satanic child sacrificing, sex trafficking rings in like, in these like catacombs below the towns and shit. And the book is called, what the fuck is it called? The devil's something, but it's like an anthropological study of this like child sexual trafficking satanic ritual scandal, which really turned out to be nothing. Like, it was just parents, like, kind of like a mind virus almost, like believing that, this like crazy. And obviously sex trafficking does exist, don't get me wrong, but people would literally dig up the town and like look for like these satanic catacombs where heavy metal and like, also the culture at the time, all this like Marilyn Manson stuff, where like all these satanic things are happening literally below the ground in their town, and all the kindergarten teachers are in on it, and a lot of innocent people went to prison. And at some point, and that's where the whole fucking doll thing comes from, like, oh, point on this doll, where did he touch you, kind of stuff, right? But if you give a child like a doll and you ask them where did they touch you, and if they say nothing, you are like, oh, you can say it, come on, go admit it. And if they say something, then you reward them with attention. Then obviously, that's leading the witness. And with children, that's very true, that you can pretty much get them to say anything if you plant that seed in their mind. And that could be the same thing with Miles here.
For sure, yeah. It's like it's supposing that there's an answer by asking the question itself. The book is Satan's Silence, right? Satan's Silence.
Satan's Silence. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So
another thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This goes into something that annoyed me, but also the whole ambiguity thing. I was really looking forward to the explanation why the fuck he was expelled from school, because that was like the only actual thing that happened. It was like, this is like the one nugget we get, is like through the whole book she's like, oh, I have to find out why he got expelled from school. His teacher said that. And that's another thing that speaks for the kind of, this shit is real interpretation, that he actually did get expelled from school for some fucking reason, right? Even though he's like a nice little model student and he's like this perfect, innocent child, there's something that he did. And at the end, he gets kind of close to admitting it. It's like, apparently he spread some rumors that others then also believed. And somehow it got to the teachers, which, sounds a lot like he was seeing ghosts and talking about it to other children. And it's not that he's evil or anything, but that's why he got expelled. Maybe like this child, we have to keep him from contaminating everyone else. But again, in this whole like ambiguity point, we don't know what the explanation is, but it pissed me off so much that until the very end, we don't get to know. It's so unsatisfying.
Yeah. So on that point, actually, that's a really good. I'm glad you brought this up because this is also, I think, in the context of this book, also potential evidence that you could use towards the ghosts are real argument. I don't think it's as you said, like him spreading rumors about ghosts. I think it's him actually speaking to them. So he says, "I said things." That's like how he he's asked if he stole at school, and he says, "No, I didn't steal. I said things." And when asked who he said them to, he's like, "I don't remember." And hang on, let me try and find this section.
Hey man, Miles, I get you. I almost got expelled from university for offensive jokes, so I also said things.
So when she's speaking, she kind of it's maybe telling that the protagonist doesn't read into this anything, because maybe if it was really the case, then she would read into this as, oh, he was definitely speaking to ghosts. But I think his language is still quite interesting, and it's also must be relevant that like why would you choose this specific thing to talk about? He said things, right? So the kind of like not naive, the kind of first thing you probably assume is that he said something really rude or inappropriate, and was expelled for that. And she doesn't ask him what he said immediately. The first thing she asks him is who he said it to, and he responds by saying he doesn't know, and this very kind of like childish like refusal to answer. Then she asks him, was it to everyone? And he says, no, it was only to, I don't remember their names. And then she says, were there many of them? And to that he says, no, only a few, those I liked. If I was going to put my tinfoil hat on and say this is a story about ghosts, I would say those few that he liked are the two ghosts, and that he was speaking to them, and that's what caused him to get expelled from school. But it's definitely significant that the protagonist herself doesn't read into that.
Again, I think we're faced with three choices. The first one is we can trust what the boy says verbatim, which would indicate that there's something wicked going on. The second one, which I really don't like because it kind of destroys the whole book in a way, is that she's so crazy that we can't even trust him verbatim. At that point, it's like, oh, well, this whole, like, at that point, we might as well say, like, oh, this was all a dream. Like, that kind of takes the whole air out of it, I feel. And the third one is that she was leading the witness in a way that she actually made him say fucked up shit, because then he gets attention, and children do work like this in real life as well. So that could be a way to save both interpretations in a way.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
Another quarrel, and this might be the last one. Going back to the whole intro of the book. So we start out again with this nice setting of I think it's a guy actually. In the very beginning of the book, the person, the narrator is a man.
Douglas,
right. And we hear from him how he's at this gathering with other people around Christmas time. And I looked this up. Apparently this was an English tradition in that kind of, late 1880s, early 19th century, that people would meet for Christmas and tell scary stories. I don't know if that's where the whole Nightmare Before Christmas tradition came from, but it is like a legit thing.
Right.
And so there's very good pacing going on at that point in the book. I feel like I'm in the scene. I'm very interested in what's going on. And then we get into the actual story that Douglas tells. And I feel like the pacing kind of gets messed up. Like the whole time while I was reading it, I'm like, so when do we go back to Douglas? Like that's when I felt the most engaged in the story, actually. Like, can we go back to Douglas and see how these people react to the story? And then the book just ends, and we never go back to Douglas ever. And I don't know. It would be so nice if we could, at the very end, at least like have a page where we go back to Douglas and all the women are scared or something, you know?
Sure. I also think as well, you know, the decision to write this story as if it's a manuscript written by this woman who's had this experience. There are two things I have to say on that. The first is that I do think it's a really cool device to when people do this, and I do really enjoy that kind of storytelling where it's like a similar to the Mountains of Madness, I think, where you have this kind of like raw experience. Yeah, it's exactly the same, and it's kind of it exists within this world, and you're kind of tapping into this manuscript that you might have found yourself. It sort of lends like this air of realism. But I would also say as well that like, and I can also imagine that as working really well with the serialized format. It's like you're finding these scraps of a diary that you're putting in this newspaper, and you get to read a little chunk of that diary every week. But I would also say it is like what we get in the end, as you point out, is that the book finishes when the moment that Miles dies. Where in if this was actually really like a manuscript written by a real person, there would be so much stuff on the other side of that. It wouldn't simply just end there. There would be some kind of reflection if it was actually written by a person. Obviously, I understand that from the point of just writing story and making it entertaining and having a solid ending. But that is a bit clumsy, or something that Henry James didn't fully consider when he was going through it.
I agree with you that I do like this storytelling device as well, and it sets the scene very nicely. But as you said, like I don't think he uses it properly, because it literally adds nothing. I don't see how it adds anything to the story. In fact, the story would have probably been stronger if we had been just in the scene from the very beginning. Maybe then we also wouldn't have read this for Christmas. But like there's no reason for us to start with this little intro and then not go back at all. Like I kind of felt like, you know, at some point I kind of realized that we're never going back probably, and I just accepted it. But for the first like half of the book, I kind of felt like I was in the movie The Matrix, and you're in the overworld, right? In the real world. And then they go back into the Matrix, and then they just decide to live in the Matrix forever, happily ever after. Kind of like they just start a little bakery in the Matrix, and we never like go back to the That's kind of how it felt. Like,
yeah, it's definitely a missed opportunity, and it would give you yeah, because because the whole story is about this, like it's this like one of the main, you know, points of this story is debating whether this is something that really happened or something that was just a figment of her imagination. To leave all of that with the reader, just the reader. I mean, I think it's probably the better way of, it might be the better way of kind of not giving too much. But then if your story is mainly about this like question of whether this really happened, whether it didn't happen, or whether it matters whether that happened or not, I feel like you either want to completely eliminate the third person, or you want to make the third person such an integral part of it that it's almost as important, if not as present, as like the rest of the book. Like you can imagine kind of like some debate happening with three like prototypical characters that all stand for these different perspectives at the end of the book, or happening halfway through, or like at different sections of the book, and how that could also kind of if it pulls you out of the action as someone, for example, comments on something that they're hearing is happening, like, oh, that would never happen, or what does this mean, or that could be quite interesting. Obviously, if it's overdone, then it can be really obnoxious, but to an extent, that could be really cool.
Yeah, I feel like the same way. If the book could have benefited if there were some moments in between where maybe he was like, something scary happens, and then the next line is like, but it's late, so let's call it a day for now. Like the Douglas says that, right? The narrator telling the story to these women in front of the fire, and then they go like, oh no, we want to hear more, we have to know what happens.
Maybe you could have a character saying, can you repeat that line? Because it makes no sense to me.
I think about this all the time. It's like if you actually speak to people in real life, I feel like 5% of all dialogue that you actually converse is like people asking, sorry, can you repeat that? Like, I didn't get it, or like, but that never happens in a novel, right? It's like the dialogue is always perfect.
Yeah,
everyone can always acoustically hear everyone else. Like, I wonder if anyone's written a book like that, where it's like realistic dialogue, which would probably be boring and infuriating, but I feel like that's a genre of literature that is pretty much non-existent.
Super realism. I mean, it is used dramatically. If someone hears something that they don't believe, or if someone hears something that, if it's like beneficial to the story being told, but
yeah, exactly. But then it serves a purpose. Yeah, exactly.
It has to serve a purpose. But I mean, you say that about everything. It's like, why do you not have anyone taking a shit in a book or a movie? Because it's
right.
normally doesn't serve the story. Something symbolic about shitting for that very reason, I think.
True. Yeah.
So speaking about shit,
mm-hmm.
What did you like about this book? Tell me what you liked about it. Like, if we're sort of coming to the end of this, closing our thoughts.
There was pretty much only one point which I mentioned already, which is that it does manage to portray this kind of surreal feeling of not knowing what is real and what's fake quite well compared to other books who've done it. And before, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I want to throw in a little point that's unrelated. I've noticed that with a lot of horror stories, there's always kind of a question of when do we bring in the first supernatural element. And I feel like this book is on the kind of later half. Like, I feel like in the first half of the book nothing really happened at all. And like the first time the ghost really appears is like about halfway in, maybe I'm misremembering that, but
I think it's a little bit.
It makes me
it's somewhat early, not like super early, but yeah.
It makes me think about if there's like an ideal point in like if we like make an archetypal horror story, like when is the ideal point in the story where we start to do scary shit? And also on the point of like having in like a little intro, give me 1 second. The Haunting on Hill House, we had the same issue where the narrator starts in her little cabin with her sister, and then she takes this long ass fucking drive to the house, and until she even gets to the house, there's like a whole little intro that really, did we need that? But it also does kind of set the scene. So what's really going on here? In The Mountains of Madness, which hasn't come out yet, it's gonna come out in January to everyone listening in December, but we have this group of expedition like scientists, and there's like this whole narration intro of why they're going on this expedition, and then it takes a long while until they actually get to the scene of the action. And in this book as well, we have the little intro with the people gathering around the fire telling scary stories. And it makes me think, like, why is it that in horror stories we always have like a little preamble that we never really go back to, it seems? And like, yeah, if I was to extract the ideal horror story, can you make some generalization about how to introduce the story and when to introduce the first horror element?
So on that note, I think when I was reading it, I did think it. Speaking of Haunting of Hill House, now, I did think that the intro, like the beginning sequences, especially before the protagonist leaves and during that drive, were definitely long. But I think whether they're too long or not, I think in any case it was probably a little bit too long. But what I would say is the reason that feels unnecessary now, I think, is just because the payoff at the end was so poor. And I think if everything worked out, if there was an ending that was more, I hate the word satisfying. It's a bit annoying to say like a satisfying ending, because it's like, in what way is it satisfying? But when you know it, right? When you have an ending that works and that makes sense and it brings the book together holistically, like, it. And I feel like that sequence didn't necessarily serve that, but if it had, it would have been like a great. And I think I love the decision of doing that. Like, I love this like meditative drive where you're just having the characters' thoughts and like these little kind of vignette sequences in different places, when she sees the house and when she goes to the place for lunch and when she goes to the diner. I think another thing as well that we can't really do anything but give them not the benefit of the doubt, give them go easy on them, I guess, is with some classic to modern literature, is that there are a lot of issues with pacing, and there are a lot of issues with unnecessary elements. You do get a lot of that. I think it is like a symptom of bad writing, and I think there are plenty of books that are very old that do an amazing job at keeping things consistent and important. But yeah, there is a lot where it's just not really the case, but they can still have positive things about them.
Yeah, now you got me thinking about, and I just looked this up. So when we read The King in Yellow 2 years or so ago on Halloween, we talked about how William Chambers, the author, introduced this kind of idea of the unreliable narrator in horror to the genre. Like, I don't know if he was actually the first to do it, but apparently he like popularized it. And so that was published in 1895. This was 1898. And, clearly very much plays with the idea, like, of the unreliable narrator. And then we had The Haunting of Hill House, which was a bit later as well, but, certainly not before Chambers. So it makes me think, like, how much of these books, like both this book and The Haunting of Hill House, how much were they actually influenced by Chambers? Because if he really did invent this kind of idea of the unreliable narrator, I mean, that's like the main juice of both of those books.
Yeah, for sure.
And this was 3 years later only, so.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question how proliferated were these books at the time, and how much influence did they actually have in such short a time? Yeah.
It's weird that we have so much, because I don't think it's that common today in like modern horror, but it seems in this period we have a lot of horror talking about or having this unreliable narrator as the main element, which makes you think, I guess, like what are the social conditions or the culture at the time which made this like a thing that people contemplated. Like, what does this reflect about society? Is this like we're doubting our values or something? I don't know. Is it like about the kind of awareness of the field of psychology that, there is such a thing as hysteria and all that? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it could also be, access to improvements in like access to information and the understanding of like ideas about narratives and things like that. But yeah, actually not but. So there's a movie called Rashomon, yeah, which is basically, it's like a series of interviews about a crime. I can't remember exactly the content, but the what's characteristic about it is a series of interviews about it's about like a murder that happened on like some country pass, and like the whole. So it's not about unreliable narrators, but it's about it's literally a series of interviews with these people, all kind of giving different perspectives on the same thing, and I think that's from the 1950. So obviously it's much further, and it's a film, obviously, but yeah, there are definitely more modern examples of that kind of thing. One thing that I would say as well, whether or not we see this today or not, is that the difficulty with a lot of books today, I think one of the reasons that we're drawn to classics more is not necessarily because they're better written, because oftentimes they're actually not. Oftentimes they're so much more of a pain to read, but you do get this. You are given this kind of more fresher, raw interpretation of these ideas that are commonplace today, whether that's like this idea of like, the unreliable narrator, or if we're talking about like religious texts, for example, reading Genesis and thinking, and even Zarathustra, like how did these formative kind of moral stories inform storytelling today and stuff like that. So from that perspective, I'm definitely very like I feel like I'm not less critical, because I still think we've definitely broken this book down, and I think it was good that we kind of talked about how we could make this book better if we were to rewrite it. But like with Kafka, for example, like I'm much more forgiving of his kind of half finished, like half baked writing, because of how fresh and interesting the ideas are and the way that he kind of communicates those.
But yeah, before we go on to the Kafka point, which is also quite interesting, but yeah, you got me thinking now about, because you mentioned Zarathustra again, and that also being the like 1880s, and the whole idea being the demystification of the world and industrial revolution and people not believing in God anymore, and science is the new talk of the day, and we can now go around the world on a ship and we know where everything is, and we've kind of broken down all this like mysterious elements to the planet, and we're now, a lot of people are now seeing the world through the laws of physics. We figured out the matrix kind of thing. Maybe that's also what informed this boom of unreliable narrator in horror, the idea of like all these ancient like texts, all these meta narratives, they someone told those as well, and we're not sure if we can really trust a narrator in all ways. And with people perceiving reality, like, are they actually, I guess kind of fucking Descartes talked about this already, but like, can we really trust what we experience? Or
yeah, that's a good point for sure. Okay, things that I liked about the book then, since you're not going to ask me this question.
Sorry. Nick, what did you like about the book?
I guess I've probably already made it clear the things that I like about this book, but
well, for fuck's sake.
I'm going to say it again anyway. It's good to summarize. Even though I had huge problems with the way that it was written, and I found it really, 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 really tedious at times, I did think that there was some really brilliant moments, especially at the points of drama, especially in the descriptions of, for example, like the protagonist trying to read into the children's expressions and behavior and stuff like that. I think I actually found myself like highlighting passages that I just liked the way, like the writing style, because to like refer back to try and emulate in my own writing, or like to try and integrate in some way that kind of, I think it's, when it's not like overly convoluted and unnecessary and too many commas and sentence clause ordering is all fucked up. When it's not like that, there are some great moments. I think the one thing that I liked, and I kind of would have maybe even liked more for the story to kind of hinge on further, was this like this class thing. It was this pretty kind of like, it was always in the background, but I do quite like the idea of, that a lot of this story and the legitimacy of this woman's visions or experiences were carried by the governess, Mrs. Groves, who was kind of almost forced by knowledge of her class position to believe everything that was being said to her and to encourage that. And also the relationship with the protagonist and the children. A story that kind of hinges more on that even more I would be really interested in reading. And yeah, I guess as, whether or not this is like, when we part of the problem with our, I think, approach, maybe not our approach, maybe this is my approach, but and I guess this is the same when you're trying to find any book worth reading, is that even things that are part of the canon and have been read for a long time, at some point you kind of have to wonder whether they're necessarily worth still reading, or whether there are things that do it better now. I've always kind of like railed a little bit against, you get this a lot with like film people too, like you have to watch this obscure old early period Soviet movie in order to understand cinematic language, in order to understand what editing means or what a montage is, and you have to watch this and like scratch your chin and really like appreciate it in order for you to like actually like understand or appreciate movies generally. And I do think it's definitely worth trying to find what is good about these things. But I think also in this case, I'm talking about the things that I like, but I'm actually kind of trying to deliver a death blow now. I think when you have something that's like, maybe I need to look into this more before making this statement, but like when you see something that's like clearly been written for a very, very, popular kind of serialized, like popular audience, like entertainment kind of literature, there is kind of a limit to how much you can kind of expect from it, I think. And then looking just at the horror itself and thinking like, is this really the best book to do this kind of thing? I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I don't have much to add or really dig into what you just said, but I guess looking back, it makes me appreciate how, if I had just read this for myself, I probably would have just gone away with a kind of feeling of frustration with the book, and like, not that like I didn't hate the book that much, like it wasn't that intense, it just kind of bored me, I guess. But yeah, talking about it, and I guess that's why we started the podcast, but talking about it made me get at least 3 times more value out of it than just having read it.
100% agree.
So yeah, and yeah, I guess I don't know if this is going to become a theme on the podcast. Let's not try to do too much horror, but
yeah,
I feel like we're like discovering the archetypes of horror stories, like, at the end of the day, and this goes into like the whole union, like, oh, how many stories are there really if we break it down? Like, the hero saves the girl, or like, fucking the Jordan Peterson, like, oh, you have to go into the belly of the whale and all that stuff, right? Like, like if we really come down to it, and this, like, yeah, if we distillate everything down to its essence, how many different types of stories are there? I guess with horror, it does feel like there's like, 1, the unreliable narrator, 2, like realistic, like human kind of slasher, murder, psychological horror, 3, ghosts are real and they're spooky. Like, it makes me think about like how many archetypal horror stories are there actually, because it can't be much more than surely it's not more than 10, right?
Well, I would say those are probably more tropes than stories themselves. Firstly,
I suppose so, yeah. But
you when you were speaking at some point earlier, actually had me thinking about that too, like the idea that you could solve horror. Like, there's just kind of like this is what horror is. These are the parameters. Like, you can work within this. A lot of it, one of the tropes is like, am I going crazy? No one around me believes me. My life is now falling apart. And that's like such a common trope that we see here as well. Yeah. And, again, to go back to movies, I don't know really, I do love horror movies. I think horror movies are really fun and exciting, and they're a very distinct genre, and there are a lot of really great movies in that genre too. And I think it's because there's something different about it which doesn't really work for, at least maybe it's not thought about in the same way as other genres like comedy or action movies or whatever. That it's kind of like thought about in the same way that people might think about like, a lot of different art forms or hobbies or whatever. So we have a breakdancing friend, and it reminds me of him speaking about breakdancing. And one of the things, from a kind of outside perspective, obviously it's difficult to understand like what the differences between these different things might be, but hearing him speaking about it, the things that are most exciting are when people take a common like move, for example, and they inflect it in a certain way which adds their own personality. And it's like tinkering with the tools that already exist and like using them in different ways and different combinations and like pushing it in different ways that are essentially mostly limited by human physicality. Obviously there are people that are more like physically competent than others, and some people that can do amazing things that other people can't do, some things that only certain people can only do. But a lot of it is kind of like this. There are like these genres of dancing, for example, and these expected like rule sets and expected move sets and stuff like this. And like when you bend these in certain ways and when you apply creativity to them, you can come out with something that is novel and interesting and that people appreciate. But it nevertheless still fits within this group of breakdancing. And if you were to go out and start doing ballet dancing, it wouldn't be considered the same thing, and it just wouldn't. You would have no gauge of whether it's good or bad. And I think horror is kind of very in a similar thing. I guess that's genre movies generally. If we think about like a movie like, we watched Stalker together, I think last year or earlier this year, and you would have no luck really kind of trying to break that movie down with genre. You're not like, oh wow, I love the way that this movie takes this common element and does something with it, because it's such an unusual movie. Then there's nothing really like it. And so in movies, and I think in literature as well, people kind of put horror on a really high horse, and they sort of, I think it's almost like maybe a bit fashionable to sort of treat horror as like this super intellectual genre that if you love horror, you're like ultimate film buff. But I think it's also like it's like nerdy, if that makes sense. It's like you can get into the grit and the differences and the way that they play with tropes and stuff.
Yeah, I think horror is especially susceptible to that kind of archetypal analysis of like there are only so many sources where the horror element can come from. And, movies like Stalker that are truly original and don't really fit into any box, I feel like you can't easily do that with horror. Like there's always, there are only so many reasons why something couldn't be scary. And at the end of the day, like if it's not scary, then it's not horror, right? So
that's a really good point. Yeah.
Like I'm really excited to read a book that is very different from everything we've read so far in the horror genre. Like if some author would manage to introduce spookiness through a way that is original and hasn't been like fucking done to death before, that would really make me want to read it. Whereas I think if we read another horror book, even if it was really, really well written, if the device of spookiness was another fucking unreliable narrator, I would probably shoot myself in the first 10 pages, even if it was a good book.
So this is another thing as well, and I'm glad you brought that up. So you said if it's been done before, this is like the curse of like genre fiction. I think generally is that even if you go back, even if The Turn of the Screw was the third unreliable narrator book ever to be written, you'd read that today from your perspective and go, oh, this is such a terrible, this is such a poor management of this trope. But and this is like why I was talking about like film dudes saying that you have to watch some like obscure like random film from 1940s in order to understand cinema, where it's like, you can watch it and you can appreciate it for what it is, but is it actually like well done, and is it actually like, does it do justice outside of like being significant for the history of literature or film? And yeah, so, you know, we're at this like critical mass with so much literature and film today, where it's like we have so many of these like predetermined, like already perfectly explored pathways and tropes and stuff, that it's difficult to know where to go. But I think the remedy to that is like, yeah, kind of like what you were pointing at, the kind of ideal book that you would like is something that's incidentally a horror, not actually made to be a horror, but like, and in a way, you know, it's like going to bring up Kafka like I do probably every fucking episode. Kafka is like incidentally horror, I would say. Like it's not written to be horror. It's like just it is horrifying.
Yes, you're perfectly correct in saying that. But at the same time, Kafka also is its own kind of genre of horror, I feel like, at this point. Like that kind of because in what we've read so far, we have the intentionally unreliable narrator, where in Kafka, you're pretty much certain that you can rely on the narrator. Like what he's experiencing is actually true. But the surreal feeling of the world comes from somewhere else, right? It's not that this person is crazy in imagining that whatever, you know, the basement in the ship of the Stoker is going forever and forever, and there's just another staircase. Or like in the trial, he goes into the attic and like there's just fucking crazy amount of rooms and it never ends, and like there's all these little people living their fucking wretched lives in every single door. But you're at no point in Kafka do you ever go, is this guy crazy? Like, is he just imagining this? It's always very somehow, and I have no idea how writers do this, but it's very, very clear in Kafka that we can actually rely on this narrator. Somehow, however, he still introduces the surrealism in a different way, which was what makes him so good, I think.
Maybe the difference then is, because you are right, we do have like Kafkaesque, which is not always referred to with horror, like specifically, but I guess all you can really hope as a writer is for your particular thing to be your namesake. Whether it's, you know, this is a Chambers-esque story, for example, or like, rather than it just kind of being defined as this broader like term like unreliable narrator. But I mean, I think in the case of Kafka, like it's like only Kafka could really fully and has really fully like done Kafka, I think. But then again, I'd probably have to read a lot of his imitators to really properly say that. But I do think there's something like more holistic about his writing. It's not just like one element. It's really like the whole thing. It's not just like tacking on this one idea that he's had onto this boring story, but it's like really everything about his writing that adds to what that term means.
I totally agree. Yeah. Another element, for example, in addition to the surrealism, is the portrayal of, I guess, the state or like systems, social systems, and how they, you know, abstract humanity, I guess. Like you just become a cog in the system or whatever without being too obnoxious about it. But so in that way, Kafka is really original, and it made me think of like The King in Yellow, The Yellow Sign. That was the only story I remember that I really, really liked, and that was genuinely scary. And I reading this book and what we just talked about made me think like, why was that story scary? Like, what was so different about it? And I guess it uses a trope that's not too overdone, which is the whole like predeterminism of like, we start out with some idea that, and obviously this is informed by the corpus of the book. So to recap for everyone who hasn't read The Yellow Sign or The King in Yellow, there's this mythology about this like theater piece that it's like haunted, and if you read it, you get sucked into this other dimension, or not physically, but you know, like scary shit from a like parallel reality could occur in real life or something. And I think that story is scary. It's like the fourth short story in that book, but it wouldn't be scary on its own, right? because it is within the corpus of the yellow sign, within the corpus of the King in Yellow, we've already skipped that little intro paragraph that we always have in these horror stories, whether it's the woman driving to the haunted house, or whether it's this like, let's gather around the fire before Christmas time. We already are set into like this horror element. We know what's going on, kind of. We know that there is this kind of otherworldly element. And then the story starts without any fucking boring preamble, just right into the action. We're in the room of the painter, and, you know, we get straight into it. And I feel like, I don't know, I'm not going to say that that's like the best way to do horror or anything, but yeah, if we could find something that has originality like that story, again, I would be keen to read that. That wasn't very neatly wrapped up, but I hope someone understands what I said.
No, I think that's a good point. Okay, I think we should wrap it up here then. Good discussion of the book, good discussion of horror generally. Any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
I mean, Merry Christmas. This was supposed to be the Christmas special. It wasn't very Christmassy, but we're gonna publish this as the third Christmas special, so deal with it, I guess. Nick, if you had to try really, really hard, what would be the most Christmassy element of this story, beside the obvious?
The most
how can
element.
How can we possibly reclaim this episode as a Christmas special?
I know. It's about a fictitious man that visits the home of children. There we go.
And leaves little presents in the form of dead boys.
Exactly. All right. So you should be listening to this. Well, maybe not listening to this in December, but this is coming out in December. We have The Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft coming out 1st of January. So keep your ears out for that one. And next episode will be Faust, I believe.
By Goethe.
All right, that was a very Goethe episode. Goodbye, everyone.
All right, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.